Hi, my name is Phoebe Mousley-Jones, and I am an 18-year-old A-level student and trustee of the Help Rescue the Planet charity. When Dr. Russell-Jones first asked me to speak at this conference as a representative of the young generation, I was flattered, but my first thoughts were, I'm not an expert on climate change or the science behind it. What can I possibly offer to this project with the limited knowledge I have? But, as some of you may already have gathered, Dr. Russell-Jones isn't put off by the word no, and so here I am today. Young people under 25 constitute 50% of the world's population, and therefore hold huge potential to be catalysts of change. As a generation, we are already inheriting the consequences of the choices made by our parents and grandparents, devastating consequences that we will pass on to our own children and grandchildren unless we act now. Many young people are well aware of the challenges of climate change and recognize it as one of the defining factors of their lives and futures. However, for others, climate change remains an abstract concept, largely irrelevant to their lives as they are not yet directly affected. It remains an overwhelming issue that it is easy to dismiss as a problem too large and complicated, a problem that someone else will deal with. But climate change is happening, and we, as a global collective population, are the ones who will suffer if we choose not to take direct action. A climate imbalance is essential to human life, but we are often not aware of our dependence on it and how acute the impacts will be on people in some parts of the world within my lifetime. Tragically, the effects of climate change are going to be felt by those in developing countries first, as they have fewer resources to adapt socially, technologically, and financially. Poor rural communities are often more reliant on natural systems to support their livelihoods. The effects of rising global temperatures in such areas of the world are already being observed. In the Sahel region of Africa, for example, declining agricultural production as a result of drought has forced people out of their homes for the past 30 years, a pattern expected to accelerate as a result of climate change, putting the lives of the 60 million people that live in the region at risk. I was shocked to find out that such impacts are already taking place. Shahid Ali Bola is an island in Bangladesh, sometimes flooded by the river that surrounds it. However, for the last 2 years, typhoons have devastated the island. The waters rise and destroys the shore to the point where the houses in Bola are no longer habitable, and the residents of the island have been driven from their homes to the nearby city of Dhaka. By the end of the 21st century, by which time my grandchildren will be in their 40s, scientists' projections suggest that the global average temperature could reach up to 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels, meaning at least a further 2-meter rise in global average sea levels. This may not pose such an imminent threat to those of us living in Britain, but such a seemingly insignificant sea level rise could spell disaster for those living in low-lying nations. For the 320,000 people living in the Maldives, just a 1-meter rise in sea level would completely engulf the islands, despite their aim to be a carbon-neutral nation within the next 7 years. If the current rates of global warming continue unchecked, the Maldives will be gone by the end of the century. This is within the average lifetime of a baby born in Britain today. Agriculture is acutely vulnerable to climate change-related damage. Most young Africans and Indians live in rural areas where agriculture accounts for 65% of total employment. Climate change increases the likelihood of extreme weather events such as severe storms, hurricanes, droughts, and floods, and therefore poses a significant threat to the livelihoods and lifestyles of the young people in developing countries who are dependent upon their environment in order to survive. But for these same reasons, it is also developing countries that have the least agency for change. Collectively, developed countries are responsible for over 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, despite the fact that developing countries such as China are building one new coal-fired power station every week. Whilst developing countries are experiencing extreme rapid economic growth and consequently emitting more and more greenhouse gases, wealthy countries remain the major consumers of both fossil fuels and other resources. We, as a developed nation, have many of the technical and financial resources, social organizations, and political structures required to reduce the causes and in turn the effects of climate change. Democracy is about the popular vote, but it's never going to be a popular move to implement the kind of changes that are needed until we are in a global crisis, unless there is a fundamental cultural shift. However, the dangers posed by climate change are not limited to marginal communities in developing countries. The impacts will also hit a lot closer to home. Computer models suggest that temperature changes will not be evenly distributed around the Earth. Land areas will warm more than the oceans, and high latitudes will warm more than low latitudes. Scientists predict that most of North America, all of Africa, Europe, Northern and Central Asia, and most of Central and South America are likely to warm more than the global average. If these predictions prove accurate, we in Britain could face increasing risks of drought, subsequent crop failure, and limited food supplies as a result of the warming. The threat of starvation could also lead to mass migrations away from the worst affected regions around the world, meaning that we in Britain could be amongst those faced with the risk of severe, prolonged conflict over land and resources. By 2080, sea level in Britain could be at least 60 centimetres higher, though this will be greater in the south than the north due to the tilting of the British Isles. There will be a 17-fold increase in flood risk along the east coast. London could face a £25 billion clean-up bill after a freak storm surge overwhelms the Thames barrier. As precipitation patterns change, prolonged dry seasons could cause crop productivity to decrease, exposing more people to starvation and reducing the amount of water available for health and hygiene. Perhaps my children and grandchildren will be caught up in conflict and face privation as wars over these resources intensify. Nobody knows for sure, for we cannot always give precise predictions of the exact impact that climate change will have on any one local population. But what I do know is that there will be impacts, some of which are already being observed, as in the case of Shahid Ali Bola. I don't want to have to live with the knowledge that my children and grandchildren are going to suffer the consequences of my actions, my failure to confront this uncomfortable reality. If greenhouse gas emissions continue at present levels, generations to come will have no choice but to manage the unavoidable impacts of climate change. The good news is that we have the chance to act now. There is an urgent need to adopt more sustainable lifestyles and economies with lower greenhouse gas emissions. Young people are not powerless, but our time is running out. The UNESCO Youth Exchange Climate Change Guidebook asserts that we, the young generation, must be the agents of change in addressing this crisis we have created, and everyone has a role to play. As a global community, the lifestyles we lead as individuals, the policies our governments implement, and the way our industries behave all have an impact on this one Earth that we share. There are already youth movements around the globe that have begun to confront the issue of climate change head-on, taking an active role in projects that range from educating others on the issues of climate change, raising awareness of the need for action, to influencing the choices of key decision makers around the world. As Sarah Svensson of the Swedish Youth Advisory Council puts it, the first step is to make sure that everyone understands exactly what the challenge is, then convince individuals that their actions count, even though the challenge is so big. Our campaign will try to demonstrate that everyone can contribute something, that it's possible to achieve real change when all sectors of society act together. The question is, how do we engage other young people like me with this issue? How do we make it directly relevant to them and their lives? It is not a simple problem, and there is no one solution. But understanding the relationship between climate change and our lifestyles as individuals is an essential first step, together with a greater long-term awareness of the impact of our actions. There's substantial evidence of extreme short-term thinking in today's society. For example, a recent article in the Daily Mail, a newspaper with the largest online readership in the world, criticizes the green governmental measure requiring insulation to be fitted on all home improvements. It reports a senior industry source accusing the new regulations of financially penalizing law-abiding citizens, thereby failing to acknowledge the long-term benefits for themselves and future generations of such investments. We need influential people in the business world, not just to greenwash, but to realize that fundamental change is needed. It is these people, along with us as consumers, that have the most powerful agency for change. Turning away from consumerism and towards localism, and seeking out alternative lifestyles can all minimize the impact we have on the environment. In the long term, the most worrying models predict the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. If this melts, world sea levels could rise by 7 meters. 90% of the world's fresh water is locked up in Antarctica. If the western Antarctica ice sheet melts, then sea levels rise by another 6 meters. A 13-meter rise could mean a Thames tidal surge reaching Windsor Castle, the oldest and largest occupied castle in the world, which has been a royal residence for nearly 1,000 years. All of us in this room can safely assume that melting on such a large scale will not happen in our lifetime. But what about generations to come? I address you here not as an expert, but as someone who has in a very short space of time learnt enough to be forcibly struck by the gravity of the situation. What I've heard over the course of this conference has reinforced this sense of urgency. I'm glad that I was asked to speak, because it is only through my recent involvement with this campaign that I have learnt about the severity of the situation and the importance of making changes to my own lifestyle, and just as importantly, of encouraging others to do the same. Thank you.